28-year-old musician Omar Medina is visiting his mom.
Omar was a quiet kid, but very observant. He was very, very smart. He was a brilliant musician. We grew up in a single-family home, and me being the oldest, I have a middle brother, and then he was a baby. My mom and him would communicate more like brother and sister, and I was the one who was like the mom to them.
Look who it is.
He was a great uncle.
Omar!
He was just brilliant. Kids loved my brother, you know? He was just so loving with them. I saw that he was like a little bit anxious. So, you know, he was kind of like pacing back and forth. And then I turned to his car and I saw that all his stuff was there.
Omar is moving out of his house share. He hasn't yet lined up his next place.
Gonna be okay?
I'll be fine.
I told him, I'm like, why don't you just leave your stuff here? You know, like just stay with my mom. But my aunts were at my mom's house and I have like 6 of them. So they were all there and chatting. And so he was like, no, I'll wait until they leave. So I said, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you later.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Just tell my mom I'll be back. And I said, okay, well, just call me or let me know. So that day I was gonna go watch a movie with some friends. After I watched the movie, I get home and he wasn't there because he was supposed to come back home. I'm like, okay, where's he at? So I sent him a message and I saw that in Messenger that he received it. And then after a few hours, I sent another message and he didn't receive it. That's when I started getting a little bit worried, but then I'm like, okay, maybe just he went out with some friends or I don't know.
Hey, Mom.
Then the next morning, my mom called me and she asked me, like, have you spoke with Omar? That's when I got worried.
What, still?
If she hasn't spoken to him, then, you know, something's a little bit off here.
Yeah. Okay.
So I called the police department and I told them that my brother was missing.
Hi. My brother's been missing for over 48 hours.
They immediately get entered into the missing person system. Community service officer gives some advice, some things that the family member can do to try to help find their missing loved one.
Okay.
When law enforcement gets involved, oftentimes we need search warrants or subpoenas. But family members can reach out to, say, service providers and say, my brother has been missing and I'm just trying to help find them so they can request records.
So the first thing that I did was I tried to get his phone records. But for some reason, since the last time that I saw him, we can't see incoming calls.
Alicia pulls in friends to help with the search.
A few of my friends got together so we could give out missing persons flyers.
We were out there just looking for him. We reached out to friends via Facebook, just any lead that we could think of.
Hey.
I get a call. Hey, we found your brother's car.
Okay, yeah. I'll be right there. Yeah.
You need to come down here like right now. It was only like 2-3 blocks away from where Omar lived. So I get there and I tell everybody, do not touch the car. I'm looking at it. All his stuff is in the car. And we're just like, okay, this is it, right? Call the cops.
The Chula Vista Police Department and officers, patrol officers, actually responded out to the scene.
My brother's been missing for over 2 days, and we just found his car here.
When I met Alicia, she was very desperate to find her brother. She found his vehicle, but was unlocked. And a lot of property was in the vehicle. There's actually things, computers, there's guitars, there's really nice clothing. Considering the neighborhood that it was parked in, that's not very normal to leave your vehicle unlocked with all that property just being visible. To me, those were red flags that there was something more to this. I've opened plenty of trunks in the past. You never know what you're gonna get. I felt for Alicia and her family because all they wanted was their son and their brother back home, safe. They loved him very much, and I could tell that. I asked her further questions about her brother and kind of what the circumstances were for him leaving.
Alicia doesn't know why he moved out.
So she asked me to go to Omar's old house. It was literally only like 4 blocks away from where the vehicle was found.
Officer Garrett visits Omar's landlord, Tim Cook.
I asked if he had seen Omar. Tim told me he had not seen Omar for maybe like 6 or 7 days, that he last saw him on his way to the casino. And I asked him if it was okay to go into his house to go look at Omar's room. There was another little house, maybe like a granny flat or a suite, that Tim told me Omar lived in. There was debris on the ground, like there was some type of work being done. And I look at the ground inside. There's water on the floor. There's no carpet. There's a window broken out. Tim told me that he was renovating it. Omar was a messy person, so he was cleaning it up to basically make some sort of game room.
When we start investigations, one of the first things we try to do is locate where video cameras may be. Now, we knew at this point where his vehicle was located, and we knew where he lived. At the end of his block was a major intersection. And there is a gas station there that had video surveillance that showed the most logical point for his vehicle to move to the point where it was located.
Detectives believe this may offer clues to where Omar went next.
So we contacted the management there and retrieved that video.
Officers hope the video will reveal how and why Omar's white Cadillac was left on the street.
Let's take a look. Start on the day he was last seen. Fast forward.
The video was for the gas pumps, and it gets the street out past the gas pumps.
Punch in right there.
So we zoomed the video in to see the cars passing through the camera and down the street and then turning on the road.
Fast forward.
We're looking for Omar or his vehicle, and we knew what Omar's car looked like.
Is that his car?
We see a white car coming up to the stop sign to go into the intersection off of Omar Street.
Slow it down. Punch in on the car.
It looks like Omar's.
Play that bit again.
It's a 4-door Cadillac, so that matches Omar's car. We felt very, very confident that we had caught a break and got Omar's vehicle being driven away from his street. We're looking inside the windows to see if we can identify who's inside. Is it Omar? Is somebody in the vehicle with him? But we can't make it out.
Let it play a while.
We had to keep watching the video to see if there's more evidence. And we see Omar walking back on foot from the direction where the vehicle had come.
Not coming back.
Investigators now have Omar's car driving to where it was discovered at 4 p.m. on the day after his family last heard from him. But they don't know who is driving it.
We need to find additional pieces to kind of put together a timeline and lead the investigation. There were a couple calls to the Harbor Police Department about an object floating in the water that was a hazard. That was reported to be a 55-gallon drum.
There were several holes drilled into it, and it had steel cable lines attached to cinder blocks. The Harbor Patrol opened up the lid, and they could see a brown blanket and what was a human hand sticking out from the blanket.
This is a very different and disturbing way to find a victim.
It was a gruesome discovery. It really shook home for not only the team, but the whole department and our city. The body was thrown out like trash out in the bay. The perpetrators didn't have any thought of human life.
The following morning, the autopsy was done.
The pathologist was unable to accurately say when this person had been deceased or how long they had been in the water. There was approximately 66 stab wounds to the body.
Based on the injuries, it was apparent that this was a very violent attack. Given the way that the victim was disposed of, it was someone who really would go to any lengths to make sure that this victim was never found again.
There was no identification on them, but there were some tattoos on the body. In particular, there was a tattoo on his ankle. So we reached out to the family.
I wanted to know if Omar had any tattoos or scars.
And ultimately, they confirmed that there was a tattoo that matched the tattoo that was on the unidentified body. We believe that the body and barrel was Omar Medina. This now is officially a homicide investigation.
That way,
Investigators urgently need to establish who killed Omar and disposed of his body.
A logical starting point was video surveillance from the marina and the Bay Area. That area, the marina, is controlled by the Port of San Diego Harbor Authority, and there's cameras that cover entering and exits of the marina and different parts of the bay.
Can I take a look at the surveillance footage of the ramp? Start on the 30th, the day he disappeared. Fast forward.
They switch to the day before the body is found.
Punch him right there.
You can see the green, what looked like a Ford F-150 pickup truck with sort of a tan stripe pull into camera view.
Is that a normal boat for the harbor?
Attached to it was a smaller boat, sort of looked like something you would take out on the lake.
Those are freshwater boats. They're designed for freshwater fishing, and here it is going out in a saltwater Pacific Ocean. That boat didn't belong in that kind of water. The truck backs up to the water.
Punch in right there.
As we continue to watch the video, we see the boat go out of the jetty, out into the bay.
Have you got a camera at the bay? Can you punch in any tighter?
That captured the boat very far off, not clear at all, but actually heading out into the harbor. And then disappearing out of camera view.
See if you can find them coming back. There.
You can see within less than an hour, that same small boat returning.
Okay, keep it playing.
The boat was out of the bay for less than an hour. This is not a fishing trip. They weren't gone long enough for that.
Wait, pause it. Punch in on the boat. You see that?
We can see the boat doesn't look the same as it did when it went out.
Okay, go back to when it left.
The boat is higher up in the water. It became quite apparent that there had been something very heavy in the boat when it first went out that was no longer there when it returned.
This is when the barrel went out to sea. This is when they took Omar out into the bay.
Go through the footage of the truck again.
These two vehicles, the boat and the truck, the driver and the passenger become focuses of our investigation.
Zoom in.
We were unable to see the registered number on the boat. We were unable to see the license plate of the truck. But it's clearly a 90s model Ford pickup truck. Couldn't positively identify the passenger and the driver of the truck.
But you could definitely see it was two males. You could tell they were wearing shorts.
Officers need a closer view of the vehicles.
We have a date and a time frame. So we try to look at which way did they leave the marina.
Detectives collect video surveillance from a building near the harbor.
Load it up. What's that? Zoom in there.
It's shot from a long way away.
We don't have license plates or we can't ID anybody that's in it.
The vehicles disappear from view. Investigators can only identify the model of the truck. There are many trucks that match the description. So police try to identify the boat.
Does this look familiar to you?
One of the detectives recognized the sticker pattern as a bass tracker, bass boat.
Can you look into it for me?
So the detective reached out to the manufacturers, sent in some of the zoomed-in photos and stills of the video, and ultimately was able to identify the year range that this boat was made. We then contacted the California Department of Motor Vehicles for boats that were registered with that model and that year, and got all the registered owners in San Diego County. And there were hundreds of people listed. We started our search from there.
In the meantime, those closest to Omar are facing the news of his death.
Although it was news that nobody wants to hear, it was a really big relief because we knew where he was. And although it wasn't a state that we wanted him in, we knew that we wouldn't go crazy just looking for him for the rest of our lives. And I just prayed that he didn't suffer.
As strong as I try to be in front of my mom, in my times alone, I would break down and just cry and just sob. Desperation that I'm never gonna see him. Like, if I think about it a little bit too hard, I'll go crazy. You know, and I try not to open that door.
We start looking at people who knew Omar, and that included Tim Cook, because that was the last person that he lived with.
Tim Cook, he had just kicked him out of the detached room in the back of the house right before he went missing. And so detectives focused in on trying to figure out, okay, is he a suspect?
Detectives set up surveillance.
And they saw Tim Cook out in front of the residence, pressure washing the driveway, packing up a lot of stuff in trash bags, loading these trash bags into his vehicle that was parked in the driveway. Cook left in his red car. And then we effected a traffic stop.
Inside the bags, there was various wet rags, random clothing, and there was a distinct smell of bleach.
We seized his vehicle and the contents of the vehicle for evidence, but we hadn't developed enough probable cause to get a judge to issue an arrest warrant for the arrest of Timothy Cook for homicide.
They suspect Tim is one of the men from the marina, but have no leads on who the second man is.
So we figure out who is associated to Mr. Cook, his friends, family. As we were doing that, we learned that Tim's brother had a storage facility.
There we are. Okay, let's check it out.
So we went to that yard.
Hey, come take a look.
The truck matches the one from the marina footage.
It was pretty apparent that that was the truck that was used.
This could be the break that we've been waiting for. We seized that green truck and brought it back to our police station.
Investigators search for clues to identify the second man they saw moving Omar's body.
While processing the vehicle, we located a receipt for Home Depot.
Bag.
We could use these receipts with the timestamp to go back to his location and try to find video surveillance.
And they found a mug that had a photograph on it.
Investigators do not recognize the man in the photo.
They processed that receipt for any potential forensic evidence. A fingerprint was found on that particular receipt.
Thanks.
We started looking into the fingerprints. We got some photographs.
His photograph matches the mug.
The fingerprint belongs to a man named Derek Spurgeon.
Derek Spurgeon had an address of record that was out in the East County, almost 30-minute drive from our current location.
Can you cross-reference this to the boat addresses?
And where Spurgeon lived, there was actually a bass tracker boat registered to his girlfriend at the time.
We were able to get probable cause and get a search warrant to search that property.
I think this is the boat.
We went to the property and seized the boat that we believed was used to dispose of Omar Medina's body.
Part of it had been taken apart. There were various seating areas that had been unscrewed. They were also able to remove the carpeting from the bottom of the boat.
There were numerous cinder blocks that were very similar to cinder blocks that were used to hold the barrel down.
Though compelling, the evidence is not enough to make an arrest. The CCTV from the harbor isn't clear enough to identify the suspects. Investigators return to the receipt found in the seized truck. They view footage from the time of the purchase.
Let's start with the registers.
The surveillance footage is actually very clear.
Wasn't there. Punching right there. That's him.
You can see Tim Cook wearing a distinct long-sleeve green shirt.
Okay, play it. Punching right there. What's he got?
He's carrying cleaning supplies, a push broom, some scrub brush. His work is scaffolding. He's not a cleaner. So why does he need all these cleaning supplies? Why does he need these brand new brushes?
Tim Cook is now a prime suspect, but the evidence is still circumstantial.
So he wasn't arrested at that time, but our search warrant was granted for the residence where Tim Cook and Omar Medina lived. So we went back to that residence. We were aware from Officer Garrett's camera what it looked like when she was there. When we went there, approximately 4 days later, it was drastically different. The granny flat where Omar lived, now the drywall was ripped off. The floor was scraped off and pressure washed. There was a smell of cleaning supplies in there. The main house where Tim Cook lived, the sink was ripped out. It was literally broken with jagged edges hanging off of it. And this was all very indicative for us for a crime scene cleanup. We did forensic processing of Omar's living area, and unfortunately, we didn't find any blood there, but we found lots of chemical indications that bleach was used to clean up. Somebody went through great lengths, through great efforts to hide what occurred here in this room.
We were able to do search warrants for Tim Cook's Google account. And through that, we found that he had various photographs of all of Omar's banking information, social security number. He had everything in order to access Omar's account, including the application when he set up his bank account.
Investigators now have a possible motive, but they need proof it was Tim Cook and Derek Spurgeon who disposed of the body.
We get video surveillance from a gas station and convenience store near Derek Spurgeon's residence.
Play it from 2 hours before the boat arrived at the marina.
We were reviewing that video. We had hours of that video from the gas station.
There it is.
The green truck pulls in, and attached to it is the bass tracker boat.
It's definitely them.
This video from this convenience store was the most clear, definitive, and close-up video that we had gathered.
Punch in on the cab.
As it pulls up to the pump, we could clearly see there's also a white barrel in the bed of the truck.
Come on, get out.
That's Derek Spurgeon.
The passenger gets out, and his characteristics are matching that of Spurgeon. And he goes to the back of the boat and starts filling up with gas.
Zoom in on him.
The driver exits the truck, walks around the front of the truck, and enters the front door of the convenience store.
Did we get the internal footage?
The driver of the truck walks in, and we can see he's wearing shorts, a maroon-colored shirt, and a green hat.
Can't see his face. Keep following him.
He walks up to the cash register and purchases some items.
Kind of surreal when you're watching the video that everyone around is oblivious to the fact that there's Omar's dead body stuffed inside of the 55-gallon drum just sitting at the gas pumps.
Wait, punch in there.
He has a very distinct tattoo on one of his calves.
Bring up the video from Cook's house.
We've got him.
This is where we caught another huge break in the case. We could look at this video and identify that's Tim Cook in the vehicle, that's Tim Cook driving it, and that's Derek Spurgeon. So now we are very, very confident that we have identified our two suspects in this investigation. We executed the arrest warrants at their residence and took them into custody.
We did search warrants for call detail records. Detectives were able to see that right as they were dumping the barrel in the bay, Derek Spurgeon's cell phone connects to a tower that is right in the area of the harbor. Shortly after that, Tim Cook's phone also connects to a tower in the same area. It shows us we have the right suspects.
Tim Cook and Derek Spurgeon plead not guilty, so the case goes to trial.
Tim Cook was convicted of second-degree murder. Derek Spurgeon, eventually, he ended up pleading guilty to illegally disposing a body.
Derek Spurgeon is sentenced to 6 months. Prosecutors are unable to prove Tim Cook's crime was premeditated. He is sentenced to 45 years to life for second-degree murder. No one else was found to be involved in the murder.
The surveillance footage was really like the smoking gun. Without it, we would have had no clue what they were doing or who either of the suspects were. We believe it was a financial motive. And so everything just culminated to a head on September 30th.
Based on the evidence collected, we believe Omar returned back to his house. He was owed money. Tim Cook didn't return his deposit money since he was getting kicked out of the house. There was some sort of altercation where Omar was ultimately killed in his house in the granny flat. Later that evening, we have Tim Cook on bank records depositing into an ATM where previously he had been texting his brothers asking for money. Timothy Cook had Omar's bank information and all information he would have needed to withdraw the money from Omar's account. That next morning, he moved Omar's car down the street and around the building. We had the video of him with a 55-gallon drum in the back of his truck. He goes into the 7-Eleven and then exits and drives out to the marina where he ultimately disposes of Omar's body out there.
I don't know what is it that Mr. Cook possibly could have gone through or just, had in his heart or in his mind that he would be capable to do such a thing, over money. But what is, and what was done is done, and all we have left is to move forward. And what I wish you would tell me is that he's okay.
Omar was loved by many, and he had a lot to give. He had a lot of aspirations. He had a lot of dreams. And I think he was at the peak of his life. And I think that's how he should be remembered, as an individual that was very loved and as an individual that loved back.
That I'm very proud of the man that he was, that he is, and that I would just give everything to be able to go back to that day.
There was a very violent murder.
Took 4 knives out of my van.
A person who is simply sadistic.
I was afraid of the guy.
2 cruel individuals got together and hatched this plan.
On the Big Island of Hawaii, roads can stretch for miles without interruption, cutting through landscapes that feel both peaceful and isolating at the same time. On the eastern side of the island, near the area of Kapoho in the district of Puna, the environment is shaped by quiet coastal stretches, scattered homes, and long rural routes where vehicles may pass without warning and sometimes not at all for extended periods. It was in this kind of setting that, on December 24th, 1991, a sequence of events began that would later become one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in Hawaii's modern history. Christmas Eve is typically a time associated with preparation, family gatherings, and the anticipation of a holiday night. In many communities, activity slows down as evening approaches and roads become quieter than usual. In the rural areas of Big Island, that quiet can feel even more pronounced as the natural landscape absorbs sound and distance separates one property from another. On that evening, however, the calm of the season was interrupted by an incident that would not be fully understood in its immediate aftermath. Dana Ireland, a 23-year-old woman living on the island, was traveling by bicycle near Kapoho in Puna. Cycling was part of her routine transportation in the area, and the road network in that region often required residents to move between locations using bicycles or vehicles, depending on availability and distance. The specific circumstances of her ride that evening placed her on a remote roadway, one where visibility and traffic could vary greatly, and where help, if needed, would not be immediately present. At some point during this journey, something happened that would later be reconstructed only through limited physical evidence and interpretation. The exact sequence of events on the road was never directly witnessed in full. What became known came from what was discovered afterward: the physical condition of the scene, the state of Dana Ireland herself, and the damaged bicycle found nearby. These elements formed the foundation of the early understanding of the incident. Passers-by traveling through the area came upon a distressing sight. Dana Ireland was found in a severely injured condition on the roadside. Her body showed signs of extreme trauma, indicating that whatever had occurred was sudden and violent. Her clothing was torn, and her bicycle was located nearby, visibly damaged. The scene suggested that the bicycle had been involved in a serious impact, though the exact mechanics of what had happened were not immediately clear at the time of discovery. Emergency services were contacted, and medical assistance was dispatched to the location. The response was urgent, reflecting the seriousness of her condition as described by those who found her. She was transported to a hospital for treatment. Despite medical efforts, her injuries were too severe. Dana Ireland died a few hours after arriving at the hospital, bringing a sudden and tragic end to the efforts to save her life. From the beginning, the case carried an immediate weight, not only because of the severity of the injuries but also because of the lack of clear answers about how the incident had occurred. The location itself contributed to the difficulty of understanding what had taken place. The area around Kapoho is rural, with stretches of road that are not densely populated and where environmental conditions can quickly affect physical evidence. Weather, time, and exposure to the elements can all play a role in altering a scene before investigators are able to fully document it. In the earliest stage of the investigation, officials examined the physical evidence available at the location. The condition of the bicycle suggested that it had been involved in a significant impact. There were indications that Dana Ireland may have been struck by a vehicle prior to being found, based on the nature of the injuries and the surrounding evidence. However, no immediate suspect or confirmed sequence of events could be established from these observations alone. The evidence pointed toward a violent encounter, but it did not immediately provide a clear narrative of who was involved or how the events unfolded step by step. What made the situation even more challenging was the limited number of witnesses. In rural areas like this, especially during late evening hours, it is not unusual for long periods to pass without anyone traveling the same road. As a result, the window of time between when Dana Ireland was last known to be traveling and when she was discovered remained largely unaccounted for. This gap in direct observation became one of the central difficulties in reconstructing the case. As emergency responders focused on saving her life, the investigation into what had happened began in parallel. The scene was examined for physical traces that might help establish a timeline or identify a vehicle involved in the incident. The presence of both bicycle damage and severe bodily injury suggested a collision of significant force, followed by additional harm. However, at this early stage, the evidence was fragmented and did not yet point toward any specific individual or group. The immediate priority remained medical intervention, but once Dana Ireland passed away, the case transitioned fully into a homicide investigation. The loss of life shifted the urgency toward understanding not only how she died, but also who was responsible. Investigators faced the challenge of working with a scene that had already been affected by time and environmental exposure, making it more difficult to preserve and interpret key details. In the absence of direct witnesses or immediate leads, the early phase of the investigation remained open-ended. The physical evidence suggested violence involving both a vehicle and subsequent assault, but the order and nature of those events were not clearly defined. This uncertainty left investigators with more questions than answers. The rural environment of the incident site, combined with the limited forensic technology available at the time, meant that reconstructing the exact sequence required careful interpretation and later re-examination of evidence. As news of the incident spread within the community, the shock was amplified by the suddenness of what had occurred. A young woman traveling on a bicycle on a quiet holiday evening had been found critically injured and had died shortly afterward. The absence of immediate explanations contributed to a growing sense of uncertainty surrounding the case. For those involved in the early investigation, the focus remained on gathering every possible detail from the scene before it could degrade further. Despite these efforts, the case did not yield quick answers. There was no immediate arrest, and no clear suspect emerged from the initial investigation phase. The available evidence established that a violent incident had occurred on or near the roadway, involving severe trauma and likely a vehicle, but beyond that, the narrative remained incomplete. The opening chapter of this case, therefore, is defined not by resolution but by absence. It is defined by a quiet road in a rural part of Big Island, a young woman traveling by bicycle on Christmas Eve, and a sequence of events that would only later be partially reconstructed through investigation and legal proceedings. It is defined by the moment she was found, critically injured and alone on the roadside, and by the brief period of time between that discovery and her death in a hospital shortly afterward. In true crime cases, the hook is often understood as the moment everything changes, the point at which ordinary life is disrupted by violence. In this case, that moment is not a single action that was witnessed or fully documented, but rather the discovery of its aftermath. A damaged bicycle, a severely injured woman, and a rural road in the fading hours of a holiday evening together form the beginning of a story that would stretch across decades, investigations, and legal battles. What happened after this discovery would take years to unfold, involving multiple phases of investigation and significant controversy. But at the center of it all remains this first moment, a quiet stretch of road in Hawaii, a Christmas Eve night, and the sudden, irreversible transformation of that silence into a crime scene that would never fully yield all of its answers. Before the events of December 24th, 1991 transformed a quiet stretch of road into the center of a long and complicated investigation. Dana Ireland was simply a young woman living her life on the Big Island of Hawaii. At 23 years old, she was part of a community shaped by distance, geography, and a slower rhythm than many urban environments. Life in that part of Hawaii often required a certain degree of independence, and for many residents, daily routines were closely tied to the landscape itself. Movement from one place to another could involve long stretches of road, limited public transportation, and a reliance on whatever means were available. For Dana Ireland, that often meant traveling by bicycle. She was described as friendly but private, someone who did not draw attention to herself, yet was approachable within her community. That balance between openness and personal space is not uncommon in smaller or more rural environments, where people may know each other in passing without necessarily sharing every detail of their lives. There is a kind of quiet familiarity in such places, where individuals become part of the background fabric of the area, recognized but not necessarily deeply known by everyone around them. Dana Ireland existed within that space, moving through her environment in a way that felt normal and routine. Her use of a bicycle as a primary mode of transportation reflects both practicality and circumstance. In areas like Kapoho and the surrounding region of Puna, distances between locations can vary widely, and access to vehicles is not always guaranteed. Roads can be long, sometimes uneven, and often bordered by natural terrain rather than dense development. For someone accustomed to that environment, Cycling becomes not just a means of travel but part of daily life, a way to navigate between home, errands, and the broader community. The environment itself plays a significant role in understanding the context in which Dana, Ireland lived. The eastern side of the Big Island is known for its rural character, with fewer densely populated areas and more open land compared to urban centers like Honolulu. The region around Kapoho, in particular, is characterized by its isolation. Roads may run for extended distances without significant traffic, and properties are often separated by natural barriers or undeveloped land. This kind of setting offers a sense of quiet and space, but it also means that assistance is not always immediately available in moments of need. On an ordinary day, this environment might feel peaceful, even protective. The absence of constant noise, the slower pace of life, and the connection to the natural surroundings can create a sense of calm that contrasts sharply with busier parts of the world. For residents, this becomes the norm. Traveling alone along these roads, whether by car or bicycle, does not necessarily carry the same immediate sense of danger that it might in more crowded or unpredictable environments. Familiarity with the area can create a sense of confidence, a belief that the routine of daily life will continue without disruption. Dana Ireland's presence on those roads, then, was not unusual. It was part of a pattern, a routine that reflected both her personal habits and the structure of life in that region. She was a young woman moving through a familiar environment, following the same kinds of paths that others in the community would have used as well. There was nothing in that routine, as it is understood from the available information, that would have suggested the events that would later unfold. Her age also places her at a particular stage in life, one often associated with transition and independence. At 23, individuals are often establishing their routines, their relationships with their surroundings, and their sense of direction. While the available data does not provide detailed information about her personal goals or relationships, it does place her within that broader context of early adulthood, a time when life is still being shaped and defined. That context adds weight to the loss, emphasizing not just the life that was lived, but the future that was interrupted. The community in which she lived would later become part of the story as well, not necessarily through direct involvement in the events of that night, but through the impact of what occurred. In smaller or more rural areas, incidents of severe violence can resonate deeply, precisely because they are less expected. The sense of safety that comes from familiarity can be disrupted in a way that feels both immediate and lasting. Even without detailed accounts of individual reactions, it is reasonable to understand that a case like this would not exist in isolation. It would become part of the shared awareness of the area, influencing how people thought about their environment and their own routines. At the same time, Dana Ireland's personal characteristics, as limited as they are in the available information, remain central. She is not defined by the incident that ended her life, but by the fact that she lived it. She moved through her environment, interacted with others, and followed a routine that was shaped by her circumstances. The simplicity of those details is important because it anchors the case in reality rather than abstraction. It is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about a person whose life intersected with that crime. The absence of extensive personal detail in the available data also reflects a broader reality in many cases. Not every victim's life is fully documented in public records, and not every aspect of their identity becomes part of the narrative that follows. What remains, then, are the key elements that can be confirmed: her age, her general disposition, her method of transportation, and the environment in which she lived. These elements, while limited, provide enough context to understand the basic contours of her daily life. The setting of Big Island itself further reinforces this context. Unlike more densely populated areas, where constant activity creates a different kind of background, the rural nature of Kapoho and Puna emphasizes distance and isolation. Roads are not just pathways, they are connections across space that can feel expansive and, at times, empty. For someone traveling by bicycle, this environment requires both awareness and trust in the predictability of the surroundings. Vehicles may pass infrequently, and the absence of immediate help is a known aspect of the landscape. This combination of personal routine and environmental context is essential to understanding the significance of what would later occur. Dana Ireland was not in an unusual place at an unusual time by the standards of her daily life. She was in a familiar environment, following a familiar pattern. That normalcy is what makes the events of December 24th, 1991 stand out so sharply in contrast. The disruption was not just physical, it was a break in the expected flow of everyday life. In telling her story, even within the constraints of limited data, it becomes clear that the case cannot be separated from the person at its center. Dana Ireland was a young woman living in a rural part of Hawaii, navigating her environment in a way that was consistent with her circumstances. Her use of a bicycle, her presence on those roads, and her position within her community all form the background against which the incident must be understood. The significance of this background lies in its simplicity. There is no indication of extraordinary risk or unusual behavior in the details that are known. Instead, there is a sense of ordinary life, of routine movement through a familiar landscape. That ordinary quality is what gives the case its emotional weight. It is not the story of someone seeking out danger, but of someone living within the boundaries of her everyday world. As the narrative moves forward into the events of that night, this context remains essential. It reminds us that before the investigation, before the legal proceedings, and before the controversies that would follow, there was a person whose life was defined by these simple, consistent elements. Dana Ireland's story begins not with the incident itself, but with the life she was living up to that point, a life shaped by her environment, her habits, and her place within the community of the Big Island. On December 24, 1991, the events that would later define the case of Dana Ireland unfolded along a stretch of road near Kapoho in the Puna district of Hawaii's Big Island. The day itself carried no immediate indication that anything unusual would occur. As Christmas Eve moved toward evening, the area settled into the slower rhythm typical of a rural community, where activity gradually diminished and long stretches of road became quieter with each passing hour. It was within this setting that Dana Ireland set out on her bicycle, traveling along a route that was part of her normal movement through the area. At some point during that journey, the sequence of events began that would later be pieced together through physical evidence and investigative interpretation. The exact moment when everything changed was not directly witnessed, and no single account exists that captures the incident in real time. What is known comes from what was discovered afterward, and from the conclusions drawn based on those discoveries. The road itself, bordered by open land and shaped by the natural terrain of the region, offered little in the way of immediate surveillance or observation. This absence of direct witnesses would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. The available evidence suggests that the first critical event involved a vehicle. Dana Ireland's injuries and the condition of her bicycle indicated that she may have been struck by a car while riding. The bicycle, found damaged near the scene, reflected the force of an impact that could not be explained by a simple fall or mechanical failure. The nature of the damage implied a collision of significant intensity, one capable of throwing a cyclist from her path and causing immediate, severe harm. The roadway itself, long and relatively isolated, would have allowed for such an encounter to occur without immediate interruption. Following this initial impact, the situation appears to have escalated into further violence. The condition in which Dana Ireland was later found suggested that the incident did not end with the collision. Her clothing was torn, and there were clear indications of physical assault beyond the injuries that might be expected from a vehicle strike alone. These elements pointed toward a continuation of the event, one that extended beyond an accidental encounter and into deliberate harm. The evidence indicated that she was subjected to additional violence after the initial contact, though the exact sequence and timing of those actions remained uncertain. The location of the incident played a significant role in shaping what happened next. The road near Kapoho is not heavily trafficked, particularly during the evening hours. Vehicles may pass intermittently, but long intervals can occur without anyone traveling the same route. This meant that whatever took place between the initial impact and the eventual discovery of Dana Ireland occurred within a window of time that was largely unobserved. The absence of witnesses meant that no immediate intervention took place, and no direct account could clarify the actions of those involved. At some point after the incident, Dana Ireland was left on the roadside in a critically injured state. The evidence suggests that she was not immediately assisted by whoever was responsible for the initial impact or subsequent assault. Instead, she remained at the scene until she was eventually discovered by passing individuals. The exact duration of time between the incident and her discovery is not clearly defined in the available information, but it represents a period during which she was alone, severely injured, and without immediate aid. The discovery itself marked the first point at which the incident became visible to others. Passers-by traveling along the road encountered a scene that immediately indicated a serious emergency. Dana Ireland was found with extensive injuries, her condition reflecting the severity of what had occurred. Her clothing was in disarray, and the damage to her bicycle reinforced the impression of a violent event. The roadside location, combined with the state of the scene, made it clear that this was not a minor accident, but something far more serious. Those who found her recognized the urgency of the situation and contacted emergency services. The response that followed was shaped by the need to act quickly in the face of life-threatening injuries. Medical personnel were dispatched, and efforts were made to stabilize her condition at the scene before transporting her to a hospital. The transition from roadside discovery to medical intervention marked a shift from the unknown circumstances of the incident to a focused attempt to preserve her life. During this period, the focus was entirely on survival. The extent of her injuries, however, presented a significant challenge. The combination of trauma suggested by the evidence indicated that she had suffered both the force of a collision and additional physical harm. Each of these factors contributed to the overall severity of her condition, making recovery increasingly unlikely despite medical efforts. She was transported to the hospital, where medical teams continued to treat her injuries. The transition from the roadside to a clinical environment represented the final stage of immediate response, where the hope remained that intervention could reverse the damage that had been done. Despite these efforts, her condition did not improve sufficiently. A few hours after arriving at the hospital, Dana Ireland died from the injuries she had sustained. Her death marked the end of the incident itself, but the beginning of a much longer process of investigation and legal examination. The events of that evening, though confined to a relatively short period of time, created a case that would extend far beyond the initial hours in which they occurred. The combination of a suspected vehicle strike, evidence of further assault, and the absence of direct witnesses left investigators with a complex situation to analyze. The incident, when viewed in its entirety, is defined by its fragmentation. There is no continuous narrative that captures every moment from the beginning of the encounter to the end. Instead, there are key points: the presence of Dana Ireland on the road, the evidence of a collision, the signs of subsequent violence, the discovery by passers-by, and her death in the hospital. Each of these elements provides part of the picture, but none alone can fully explain the sequence of events. The rural setting, while peaceful under ordinary circumstances, contributed to this fragmentation by limiting observation and delaying discovery. The same qualities that made the area quiet and remote also made it difficult to reconstruct what had happened with certainty. Without witnesses to describe the incident as it unfolded, the case relied heavily on physical evidence and later interpretation. As the incident moved from immediate response to formal investigation, these limitations would continue to shape the process. The details established during this phase formed the foundation upon which all later developments would be built. The understanding that Dana Ireland had likely been struck by a vehicle and then subjected to further violence became central to the case, guiding the direction of the investigation and influencing how evidence was evaluated. The events of December 24, 1991, therefore stand as a series of interconnected moments that, while individually identifiable, do not form a complete and uninterrupted account. They represent the transformation of an ordinary journey into a violent encounter, the delayed discovery of its aftermath, and the ultimate loss of life that followed. This sequence, though incomplete in its details, defines the core of the incident and sets the stage for everything that would come next in the effort to understand and resolve the case. In the hours following the death of Dana Ireland, the focus of those involved shifted from emergency response to investigation. What had begun as a medical crisis on a remote roadside quickly became a homicide case defined by uncertainty, limited evidence, and the absence of direct witnesses. The initial task for investigators was to reconstruct what had happened using the physical traces left behind at the scene and the medical findings associated with her injuries. From the outset, it was clear that this would not be a straightforward process. The location near Kapoho in the Puna district presented immediate challenges. The road where Dana Ireland had been found was not heavily traveled, and the surrounding area lacked the density of observation that might exist in more urban settings. By the time investigators arrived, the scene had already been exposed to environmental conditions that could alter or degrade evidence. Weather, time, and the natural characteristics of the terrain all contributed to the difficulty of preserving a complete record of what had occurred. Even small details that might have provided clarity could have been affected in ways that made them harder to interpret with confidence. Investigators began by examining the most visible elements of the scene: the damaged bicycle, the position in which Dana Ireland had been found, and the condition of her clothing all became points of analysis. These details supported the initial conclusion that a vehicle had likely been involved in the incident. The extent of the damage suggested a forceful impact, one that could not easily be explained by a simple fall or mechanical failure. At the same time, the additional signs of physical assault indicated that the incident had not ended with that impact. The challenge was to determine how these elements fit together in a coherent sequence. Without direct witnesses, the investigation relied heavily on inference. Each piece of evidence had to be examined not only for what it showed, but also for what it implied about the actions that had taken place. The possibility that Dana Ireland had been struck by a vehicle and then subjected to further harm became a central working theory. However, establishing that sequence with certainty required more than physical observation. It required corroboration, either through additional evidence or through testimony that could connect the fragments into a clearer narrative. In the early stages, no immediate suspect emerged. The lack of eyewitness accounts meant that investigators could not rely on descriptions of individuals or vehicles that might have been involved. Instead, they were left with a scene that pointed to violence, but did not identify its source. This absence of a clear suspect prolonged the initial phase of the investigation, leaving the case open and unresolved for an extended period. As time passed, the case entered a phase often associated with unresolved investigations. Without new leads or decisive evidence, progress slowed. The physical evidence that had been collected was limited in what it could reveal on its own, and the absence of witnesses continued to hinder efforts to move forward. The case did not close, but it also did not advance in a way that would lead to immediate resolution. It became, in effect, a case waiting for new information, whether through advances in analysis or the emergence of additional testimony. Years later, the investigation took a different direction. Attention shifted toward three individuals: Albert Ian Schweitzer, Lincoln Schweitzer, and Sean Schweitzer. The focus on these three brothers marked a significant turning point in the case, moving it from a period of uncertainty into one of renewed activity. The reasons for this shift were tied to a combination of factors that had developed over time, including witness statements and the re-examination of existing evidence. Witness testimony became a key component in this phase of the investigation. Statements provided by individuals were used to establish connections between the suspects and the events surrounding Dana Ireland's death. These testimonies were not direct observations of the entire incident, but rather pieces of information that investigators interpreted as relevant to the case. In situations where physical evidence is limited, such testimony can take on increased importance, serving as a bridge between what is known and what is believed to have occurred. At the same time, investigators revisited the physical evidence collected from the scene. Advances in analytical methods and the passage of time allowed for a re-examination of details that had previously been inconclusive. This process aimed to extract additional information from the available data, potentially strengthening the case against the identified suspects. The combination of reanalyzed evidence and witness statements formed the basis for the accusations that followed. However, this phase of the investigation was not without complications. The questions began to arise regarding the reliability of the evidence being used. DNA analysis, which had been expected to provide clarity, did not offer a straightforward conclusion. The results were described as unclear, leaving room for interpretation rather than providing definitive answers. In a case where certainty was already limited, this ambiguity became a significant issue. Concerns were also raised about the nature of the witness testimony. Allegations emerged suggesting that some statements may have been influenced or obtained under questionable circumstances. The possibility of coerced testimony introduced doubt into the reliability of the information being used to build the case. In investigations that rely heavily on such testimony, the credibility of each statement becomes critical. Any uncertainty about how those statements were obtained can affect the overall strength of the case. In addition to these concerns, the investigative process itself came under scrutiny. Critics argued that the procedures followed were not fully transparent, raising questions about how decisions were made and how evidence was handled. This lack of perceived transparency added another layer of complexity to the case, as it shifted some of the focus from the events themselves to the methods used to investigate them. In a situation where the evidence was already subject to interpretation, these concerns further complicated efforts to reach a clear and widely accepted conclusion. Despite these challenges, the investigation proceeded with the case against the three brothers. The combination of witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and re-examined physical traces was deemed sufficient to move forward. The case transitioned from the investigative phase into the legal system, where these elements would be tested in court. However, the issues that had emerged during the investigation did not disappear. Instead, they carried over into the next stage, influencing how the case would be argued and how it would be perceived. The investigation into the death of Dana Ireland, therefore, can be understood as a process marked by both persistence and uncertainty. From the initial examination of a remote crime scene to the later focus on specific suspects, each stage was shaped by the limitations of the available evidence and the challenges of interpreting it. The absence of direct witnesses, the ambiguity of forensic results, and the questions surrounding testimony all contributed to a situation in which conclusions were difficult to establish with complete confidence. At its core, this phase of the case highlights the tension between the need to find answers and the constraints imposed by the evidence. Investigators worked to construct a narrative that could explain what had happened, but that narrative was built from pieces that did not always align perfectly. The result was a case that moved forward not with certainty, but with a combination of evidence and interpretation that would later be examined and challenged in the legal arena. As the investigation gave way to prosecution, the unresolved questions remained. They did not prevent the case from advancing, but they ensured that it would continue to be debated. The transition from investigation to trial did not mark the end of uncertainty, but rather the beginning of a new phase in which that uncertainty would be tested under the scrutiny of the legal system. As the investigation into the death of Dana Ireland moved into the legal system, the case entered a new phase defined by formal procedures, structured arguments, and the attempt to translate a complex and uncertain set of findings into a coherent narrative that could be evaluated in court. The focus shifted from the open-ended process of gathering and interpreting evidence to the more rigid framework of prosecution and defense, where each side would present its interpretation of what had happened and attempt to persuade a judge or jury of its validity. The decision to bring charges against Albert Ian Schweitzer, Lincoln Schweitzer, and Sean Schweitzer marked a significant turning point. After years in which the case had remained unresolved, the identification of specific individuals as suspects created the possibility of legal closure. However, the path from accusation to conviction required that the evidence be organized into a form that could meet the standards of the legal system. This process involved not only presenting the facts as understood by investigators, but also addressing the uncertainties and inconsistencies that had been identified during the investigation. The prosecution's case relied on a combination of witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the results of re-examined physical traces from the scene. Each of these elements played a role in constructing the narrative that linked the three brothers to the events of December 24, 1991. Witness statements were used to establish connections and suggest involvement, while the physical evidence was interpreted in a way that supported the sequence of events proposed by the prosecution. The goal was to present a version of the incident that, while not directly observed in its entirety, could be understood as a logical and cohesive explanation based on the available information. At the same time, the defense faced the task of challenging that narrative. The uncertainties that had emerged during the investigation became central to this effort. Questions about the clarity of DNA evidence, the reliability of witness testimony, and the transparency of the investigative process all provided grounds for contesting the prosecution's claims. In a case where much of the evidence required interpretation, the ability to cast doubt on that interpretation became a critical strategy. The legal proceedings themselves unfolded within the structured environment of the courtroom, where each piece of evidence was subject to examination and cross-examination. Witnesses who had provided statements during the investigation were called upon to present their accounts, and their credibility was evaluated in the context of questioning from both sides. The interpretation of physical evidence was similarly scrutinized, with attention given to how conclusions had been drawn and whether alternative explanations could be considered. Despite these challenges, the case progressed toward a conclusion in the early 2000s. The three brothers were convicted in relation to the death of Dana Ireland. At this stage, the legal system had reached a determination based on the evidence and arguments presented during the trial. The conviction suggested that the prosecution's narrative had been accepted as sufficiently convincing to meet the required standard of proof. For a case that had remained unresolved for years, this outcome appeared to provide a form of resolution. However, the conclusion reached at trial did not bring an end to the case. Instead, it marked the beginning of another phase in which the verdicts themselves would be challenged. Appeals were filed, and the legal process continued as higher courts examined the procedures and evidence that had led to the convictions. This phase introduced a new level of scrutiny, focusing not only on the substance of a case, but also on the manner in which it had been conducted. The appeals process brought renewed attention to the issues that had been raised during the investigation and trial. The ambiguity of the DNA evidence, which had never provided a clear and definitive match, became a focal point. In cases where forensic evidence is expected to provide objective confirmation, any lack of clarity can have significant implications. The inability to draw firm conclusions from this evidence contributed to ongoing uncertainty about the strength of the case. Similarly, the reliability of witness testimony remained a central concern. Allegations that some statements may have been influenced or coerced raised questions about their validity. In the legal context, the credibility of witnesses is essential, and any indication that testimony may not have been freely or accurately given can undermine the conclusions drawn from it. These concerns were revisited during the appeals, as the defense sought to demonstrate that the evidence used to secure the convictions was not as reliable as it had been presented. The issue of investigative transparency also played a role in the appeals process. Critics of the investigation argued that certain procedures had not been conducted in a manner that ensured full openness and accountability. This lack of transparency, whether perceived or actual, added to the doubts surrounding the case. In the legal system, the integrity of the process is as important as the outcome, and any questions about how evidence was gathered or decisions were made can influence the validity of a conviction. As a result of these factors, some of the convictions and related rulings were overturned or challenged in subsequent proceedings. The legal outcome of the case became less definitive, as the initial verdicts were subjected to revision and reconsideration. This did not necessarily resolve the underlying questions about what had happened on December 24, 1991. Instead, it highlighted the complexity of translating a difficult and uncertain investigation into a stable legal conclusion. The back-and-forth nature of the legal process in this case reflects the tension between the desire for resolution and the limitations of the available evidence. On one hand, the convictions represented an attempt to provide answers and accountability. On the other hand, the issues raised during the appeals demonstrated that those answers were not universally accepted or beyond question. The case became an example of how legal outcomes can evolve over time, particularly in situations where the evidence does not offer clear and unequivocal conclusions. Throughout this phase, the courtroom served as the arena in which these competing interpretations were tested. The prosecution and defense each presented their arguments within the constraints of legal procedure, and the courts evaluated those arguments according to established standards. The process was structured and formal, but the underlying uncertainty of the case remained present, influencing how each piece of evidence was understood. The result was a legal history that did not follow a simple linear path. Instead of moving from investigation to conviction to closure, the case continued to shift as new arguments were introduced and previous conclusions were re-examined. This ongoing process prevented the case from reaching a point of finality that could be accepted without reservation. In the end, the trial and its aftermath did not fully resolve the questions surrounding the death of Dana Ireland. While convictions were initially secured, the subsequent challenges and reversals demonstrated that those conclusions were not beyond dispute. The legal system, in attempting to address the case, revealed both its capacity to provide answers and its limitations when faced with uncertainty. The proceedings underscored the difficulty of achieving definitive justice in cases where the evidence is incomplete or open to interpretation. They also highlighted the importance of ensuring that the processes used to reach conclusions are as reliable and transparent as possible. In this case, the combination of contested evidence, questioned testimony, and procedural concerns meant that the legal outcome remained subject to debate, even after years of investigation and litigation. In the years following the trials, appeals, and legal reversals connected to the death of Dana Ireland, the case did not settle into a clear and universally accepted conclusion. Instead, it continued to exist in a state of tension between competing interpretations, unresolved questions, and the enduring reality of a life lost under violent circumstances. What remained was not closure, but a complex legacy shaped as much by uncertainty as by the facts that had been established. For many, the case came to represent the difficulty of defining justice in situations where evidence does not lead to a single, uncontested narrative. The legal process had produced outcomes, including convictions and subsequent challenges, but those outcomes did not eliminate doubt. Instead, they brought attention to the ways in which different elements of a case can be understood in conflicting ways. The same pieces of evidence that supported one conclusion could also be viewed as insufficient or unreliable when examined from another perspective. This dynamic ensured that the case would continue to be discussed long after the formal proceedings had ended. At the center of that discussion were the issues that had emerged during the investigation and trial. The ambiguity of the DNA evidence remained a key point of contention. In many modern cases, DNA is often seen as a definitive form of proof, capable of establishing connections with a high degree of certainty. In this instance, however, the results did not provide that level of clarity. The lack of a clear match left room for interpretation, and that uncertainty became a lasting feature of the case. It meant that the forensic evidence, rather than resolving questions, became part of the ongoing debate. Witness testimony, another critical component of the case, also remained under scrutiny. Allegations that some statements may have been influenced or coerced introduced doubt into the reliability of those accounts. In the absence of direct observation of the incident, these testimonies had played a significant role in shaping the narrative presented in court. When their credibility was questioned, it affected not only the specific details they provided, but also the broader structure of the case that had been built around them. The possibility that key elements of the narrative were based on uncertain or contested testimony contributed to the sense that the full truth had not been definitively established. The concerns about investigative transparency further complicated the legacy of the case. The questions about how evidence was gathered, how decisions were made, and how information was presented created an additional layer of uncertainty. Even when specific findings were accepted, the processes used to reach those findings were sometimes viewed with skepticism. This distinction between outcome and process became important in understanding why the case did not achieve a stable resolution. It was not only the evidence itself that was in question, but also the methods used to interpret and present it. As a result, the case of Dana Ireland came to be seen as one of the most complex and controversial in Hawaii's history. It was often described as a cold case, not because there had been no investigation or legal action, but because the ultimate questions surrounding it remained unresolved in the eyes of many. The passage of time did not diminish this complexity. Instead, it reinforced the idea that some cases do not move toward clarity, but remain suspended between competing possibilities. For the broader community, the case carried implications that extended beyond its specific details. It highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement and the legal system when dealing with incidents that occur in isolated environments with limited evidence. It also underscored the importance of reliability and transparency in investigations, as well as the impact that uncertainty can have on public trust. When a case remains open to interpretation even after years of effort, it raises questions not only about what happened, but about how such cases can be approached in the future. At the same time, the human dimension of the case remained constant. Dana Ireland's life, though only briefly outlined in the available information, continued to serve as the focal point around which all discussions revolved. The details of her routine, her presence in the community, and the circumstances of her death were not abstract elements. They were part of a real and irreversible loss. The debates about evidence, procedure, and legal outcomes did not change that fundamental fact. They existed alongside it, shaping how the case was understood but not altering the reality at its core. The passage of decades added another layer to the case's legacy. As time moved forward, the events of December 24, 1991 became more distant, but they did not fade from relevance. Instead, they became part of a longer narrative about how unresolved cases persist in public memory. The lack of a definitive conclusion ensured that the case would continue to be revisited, examined, and discussed. Each new perspective brought with it the possibility of reinterpreting the existing information, but also the recognition that certain questions might never be fully answered. In reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the details of the incident itself, but in what it reveals about the nature of uncertainty in the pursuit of justice. The investigation, the trials, and the appeals all represent efforts to impose order and clarity on a set of events that resisted simple explanation. The fact that these efforts did not produce a universally accepted outcome does not negate their importance, but it does highlight their limitations. It shows that even with sustained attention and resources, some cases remain incomplete. This incompleteness is not a failure in a simple sense, but a reflection of the complexities involved. Evidence can be ambiguous, memories can be unreliable, and processes can be questioned. When these factors converge, they create situations in which certainty becomes difficult to achieve. The case of Dana Ireland illustrates this reality in a way that is both specific to its circumstances and broadly applicable to other cases with similar challenges. Ultimately, the story returns to the point at which it began, not in a literal sense, but in terms of its unresolved nature. A young woman was found injured on a roadside on Christmas Eve, and she died a few hours later. The investigation that followed sought to explain how and why that happened, identifying suspects and pursuing legal action. Yet, even after years of effort, the answers remain contested. The case stands as an example of how the search for justice can be complicated by uncertainty, and how the absence of definitive conclusions can shape the way a case is remembered. In the end, what endures is both the memory of Dana Ireland and the questions that surround her death. The case does not offer a clear resolution or a single narrative that can be accepted without hesitation. Instead, it presents a series of facts, interpretations, and challenges that together form a complex and ongoing story. It is a story defined not by closure, but by the continuing effort to understand what happened and by the recognition that some aspects of that understanding may remain out of reach. Even after the formal structure of investigation, prosecution, and appeal has run its course, some cases do not come to rest. They continue to exist in a space shaped by memory, interpretation, and the persistent absence of certainty. The case of Dana Ireland belongs to that category. It extends beyond the boundaries of official proceedings and becomes something that lives on in discussions, in questions that are revisited, and in the quiet recognition that not every story reaches a definitive conclusion. In the years that followed, the case did not disappear into the background of closed files. Instead, it remained present, resurfacing whenever conversations turned to unresolved or controversial cases in Hawaii. The passage of time did not simplify it. If anything, time added layers, as earlier decisions were reconsidered and earlier assumptions were questioned. Each stage of the process, from the initial discovery to the legal outcomes, became part of a broader narrative that people would continue to examine from different angles. What makes a case persist in this way is not only the severity of the crime, but the lack of a conclusion that feels complete. In situations where evidence leads to a clear and widely accepted resolution, the story tends to settle, even if it is remembered. In contrast, when the outcome remains contested, the case retains a sense of openness. It invites re-examination, not necessarily because new facts are constantly emerging, but because the existing facts do not align in a way that satisfies all perspectives. The case of Dana, Ireland reflects that kind of unresolved tension. At the center of this ongoing reflection is the question of what justice means in a situation like this. The legal system operates within defined standards, requiring evidence to meet specific thresholds in order to support a conviction. In this case, those thresholds were met at one point, leading to convictions. Yet the subsequent challenges and reversals demonstrate that meeting a standard at one moment does not guarantee that the conclusion will remain stable over time. When new questions arise about the reliability of evidence or the integrity of the process, the earlier sense of resolution can begin to shift. This shifting nature of conclusions creates a situation in which the case exists in multiple states at once. It has been investigated, prosecuted, and judged, yet it is also questioned and reconsidered. It is both resolved in certain legal contexts and unresolved in the broader sense of public understanding. This duality is not easy to reconcile, and it contributes to the enduring complexity of a case. For those who look back on the events of December 24, 1991, the starting point remains unchanged. A young woman was traveling by bicycle on a rural road and was later found critically injured. She died a few hours later, and the circumstances of her death indicated that it involved both a vehicle and subsequent violence. These facts form the foundation of the case, and they are not in dispute. What remains uncertain is how those events unfolded in detail and who is ultimately responsible. The persistence of that uncertainty shapes how the case is remembered. It is not only a story about a crime, but also a story about the limits of what can be known. In many ways, it illustrates the gap that can exist between an event and the ability to fully reconstruct it. Even with investigation and analysis, some elements remain beyond reach, either because the evidence was never available or because it was altered or lost over time. This gap does not diminish the importance of a case, but it does influence how it is understood. It encourages a more cautious approach to conclusions, one that acknowledges the presence of doubt rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely. In this sense, the case becomes a reminder that certainty is not always attainable, even when significant effort is devoted to finding it. At the same time, the human impact of the case continues to resonate. Dana, Ireland's life, though only partially documented in the available information, remains the central element of the story. The discussions about evidence, procedure, and legal outcomes all circle back to the fact that a life was lost. This reality grounds the case, preventing it from becoming purely abstract. It is not simply an intellectual puzzle or a legal debate. It is the account of a real person whose life ended in violence. This perspective is important because it shapes how the case is approached in the present. Rather than focusing solely on the unresolved aspects, it also emphasizes the need to remember the individual at its center. The details of her routine, her presence in the community, and the circumstances of her death all contribute to a narrative that is both specific and universal. It is specific in its context and details, and universal in its reflection of how sudden and unexplained violence can disrupt ordinary life. As time continues to pass, the case may be revisited in different ways. Advances in investigative techniques, changes in legal standards, or renewed attention from those interested in unresolved cases could all influence how it is understood in the future. However, Even with such developments, there is no guarantee that a definitive conclusion will emerge. Some cases remain open not because they are ignored, but because the available information does not allow for complete resolution. In that sense, the case of Dana Ireland becomes part of a broader pattern. It stands alongside other cases where the search for answers extends beyond the initial investigation and into a longer process of reflection and reevaluation. These cases often serve as points of reference for discussions about how investigations are conducted, how evidence is interpreted, and how the legal system responds to uncertainty. They highlight both the strengths and the limitations of those processes. The enduring nature of this case also reflects the way in which stories are carried forward. Even without new developments, the case continues to exist through the act of being told and retold. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects, whether it is the initial incident, the investigation, the legal proceedings, or the unresolved questions that remain. In this way, the case becomes a living narrative shaped by the perspectives of those who engage with it. Ultimately, the significance of the case lies not only in its details, but in what it reveals about the nature of unresolved events. It shows how a single incident can generate a complex and lasting legacy, one that extends far beyond the moment in which it occurred. It also demonstrates that the absence of clear answers does not diminish the importance of asking questions. On the contrary, it can make those questions more important as they continue to drive the effort to understand what happened. The story does not conclude with a final resolution, and perhaps that is the most defining characteristic of all. It remains open, not in the sense that nothing has been done, but in the sense that the results of what has been done do not fully close the case. It is a story that continues to exist in the space between what is known and what is uncertain, between the desire for answers and the reality that those answers may never be complete. In the end, the case of Dana Ireland stands as a reminder of both the fragility of ordinary life and the complexity of seeking justice in its aftermath. It begins with a quiet road on a December evening and extends into years of investigation and debate. It does not resolve into a single, clear conclusion, but instead remains as a collection of facts, interpretations, and questions that continue to be considered. Within that collection lies the enduring presence of the person at its center and the ongoing effort to understand the circumstances that led to her death. As the story of Dana Ireland's case continues beyond the boundaries of formal investigation and legal proceedings, it settles into a quieter but more enduring phase, one defined less by active developments and more by reflection, interpretation, and the passage of time. In this phase, the case becomes part of a broader conversation about uncertainty, about the limits of evidence, and about the ways in which unresolved questions can persist even after years of scrutiny. It is here, in this extended aftermath, that the case reveals some of its most lasting implications. The absence of a single, universally accepted conclusion shapes how the case is remembered. It does not exist as a closed narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Instead, it remains open, its key elements understood but its full meaning still subject to debate. The events of December 24, 1991 are not in dispute in their basic outline, but the interpretation of those events continues to vary depending on how the available evidence is viewed. This variation ensures that the case remains active in the sense that it continues to be discussed, reconsidered, and analyzed. Over time, cases like this often take on a dual identity. On one level, they are historical events, fixed in their occurrence and documented through records and reports. On another level, they are ongoing subjects of interpretation, shaped by new perspectives and evolving standards of analysis. The case of Dana Ireland fits into both categories. It is rooted in a specific moment in time, yet it extends beyond that moment through the continued effort to understand it. One of the key aspects of this extended phase is the role of memory. The way a case is remembered can influence how it is understood. In situations where conclusions are clear, memory tends to reinforce those conclusions. In contrast, when a case remains unresolved or controversial, memory becomes more fluid. Different aspects of the case may be emphasized at different times, and the narrative may shift depending on which elements are brought to the forefront. This process does not change the underlying facts, but it does affect how those facts are interpreted and connected. In the case of Dana Ireland, the enduring questions about evidence and procedure contribute to this fluidity. The ambiguity of the DNA findings, the concerns about witness testimony, and the criticisms of investigative transparency all remain part of the narrative. They are not issues that were resolved and then set aside. Instead, they continue to influence how the case is viewed. Each time the case is revisited, these elements are reconsidered, and their significance may be reassessed in light of broader discussions about forensic science and legal standards. At the same time, the case also serves as a point of reference for examining how investigations are conducted in challenging environments. The rural setting in which the incident occurred introduced specific difficulties, from the preservation of evidence to the identification of witnesses. These challenges are not unique to this case, but they are clearly illustrated by it. As such, the case contributes to a broader understanding of how context can affect the outcome of an investigation. The legal history of the case further reinforces its complexity. The progression from investigation to conviction and then to appeal and reversal demonstrates that legal outcomes are not always final in the sense of being beyond reconsideration. Instead, they can evolve over time as new arguments are presented and earlier decisions are reevaluated. This process reflects the legal system's capacity for self-examination, but it also highlights the uncertainty that can arise when different stages of the process lead to different conclusions. In reflecting on this, it becomes clear that the concept of justice in such cases is not straightforward. Justice is often understood as a definitive outcome, a resolution that establishes responsibility and provides closure. In this instance, however, the lack of a stable conclusion complicates that understanding. The efforts to achieve justice are evident in the investigation and the legal proceedings, but the results of those efforts remain contested. This does not mean that justice was not pursued, but it does mean that the outcome of that pursuit is not universally agreed upon. For those who engage with the case, whether as observers, analysts, or members of the broader community, this complexity requires a careful approach. It invites consideration of multiple perspectives and an acknowledgement of uncertainty. Rather than seeking a single, definitive answer, it encourages an understanding of how different elements of the case interact and how they can lead to different interpretations. This approach does not resolve the case, but it allows for a more nuanced engagement with it. The human dimension of the case continues to anchor this reflection. Dana Ireland remains at the center of the narrative, not only as the victim of a violent act, but as a person whose life was interrupted. The details that are known about her, though limited, provide a connection to that reality. They remind those who consider the case that it is not only about evidence and procedure, but about the impact of those events on an individual life. This perspective helps to maintain a sense of focus, ensuring that the case is not reduced to abstract discussion. As the case persists over time, it also becomes part of a larger pattern of unresolved or contested cases. These cases collectively highlight the challenges inherent in reconstructing past events, particularly when evidence is incomplete or subject to interpretation. They demonstrate that the pursuit of understanding is often ongoing and that some questions may remain open despite extensive effort. In this way, the case of Dana Ireland contributes to a broader conversation about the nature of knowledge and the limits of certainty. Looking forward, it is possible that new developments could emerge, whether through advances in forensic analysis or renewed attention to the case. Such developments have the potential to clarify aspects that were previously uncertain. However, it is equally possible that the case will remain as it is, defined by the interplay of known facts and unresolved questions. The future of the case is therefore uncertain, much like its past, and this uncertainty is a defining characteristic. In the final analysis, the case does not conclude in the traditional sense. It does not arrive at a point where all questions are answered and all perspectives are aligned. Instead, it continues to exist as a complex and multifaceted narrative, one that reflects both the effort to understand and the limitations of that effort. It is a story that resists simplification, requiring those who engage with it to accept that not every aspect can be fully resolved. What remains, ultimately, is the recognition of both the known and the unknown. The known elements provide a foundation, a set of facts that define the case and give it structure. The unknown elements create space for interpretation, for questioning, and for continued reflection. Together, they form a narrative that is both complete in its outline and incomplete in its details. In this way, the story of Dana Ireland becomes more than a single case. It becomes an example of how complex events are understood over time, how they are shaped by investigation and interpretation, and how they can continue to resonate even without definitive resolution. It stands as a reminder that the search for answers is an ongoing process, one that may not always lead to certainty, but that remains essential in the effort to understand the past and its impact on the present. Over time, the case of Dana Ireland has come to occupy a space that is neither fully resolved nor entirely inactive, existing instead in a state that reflects the long-term impact of uncertainty on both memory and understanding. As the years pass, the details of the case remain anchored in the same core events, yet the way those events are interpreted continues to shift. This ongoing reinterpretation is not driven by constant new evidence, but by the recognition that the evidence which does exist does not lead to a single, uncontested conclusion. In this way, the case becomes less about a fixed outcome and more about the process of examining and re-examining what is known. One of the defining characteristics of this phase is the gradual transformation of the case into a reference point for broader discussions about justice and investigation. When people revisit the case, they often do so not only to understand what happened to Dana Ireland, but also to consider how such cases are handled within the systems designed to address them. The questions raised by the case extend beyond its specific details and touch on larger themes, including the reliability of evidence, the role of interpretation, and the balance between certainty and doubt in legal decision-making. The ambiguity that surrounds key elements of the case continues to play a central role in this reflection. The DNA evidence, which might have been expected to provide clarity, instead remains a source of debate. Its lack of definitive alignment with a clear conclusion means that it cannot function as a final answer. Instead, it becomes one part of a larger puzzle, contributing to the overall picture without resolving it. This situation illustrates how even highly regarded forms of evidence can be limited by the conditions under which they are collected and analyzed. Similarly, the concerns about witness testimony remain relevant. Testimony is often a critical component in cases where direct physical evidence is limited, but its reliability depends on the circumstances under which it is given. When questions arise about whether statements were influenced or obtained under pressure, the impact extends beyond the specific testimony in question. It affects the broader narrative that has been constructed around those statements, introducing uncertainty into the interpretation of events. This dynamic ensures that the case continues to be examined with caution, as each element is weighed against the possibility of error or misinterpretation. The issue of investigative transparency also continues to influence how the case is understood. The perception that certain aspects of the investigation may not have been fully transparent contributes to a sense of unresolved concern. Transparency is closely tied to trust, and when it is called into question, it can affect the credibility of the entire process. In this case, the lingering questions about how evidence was handled and how decisions were made remain part of the ongoing conversation, shaping the way the case is viewed in retrospect. As the case persists in this state, it becomes part of a larger pattern of situations in which definitive answers are difficult to achieve. These cases often share certain characteristics, including limited or ambiguous evidence, a lack of direct witnesses, and complex investigative histories. They highlight the challenges inherent in reconstructing past events and the ways in which those challenges can influence outcomes. In this context, the case of Dana Ireland serves as an example of how these factors can combine to create a situation in which certainty remains out of reach. The passage of time adds another dimension to this complexity. As years turn into decades, the distance from the original events increases, and the context in which those events are understood can change. Advances in forensic science, shifts in legal standards, and evolving perspectives on investigative practices all have the potential to influence how the case is interpreted. At the same time, the core facts remain unchanged, creating a tension between what is fixed and what is subject to reinterpretation. This tension is a defining feature of the case's long-term existence. In considering the case from this perspective, it becomes clear that its significance is not limited to its immediate details. It also lies in what it reveals about the process of seeking understanding in complex situations. The effort to reconstruct what happened to Dana Ireland involved multiple stages, each building on the previous one while also introducing new questions. The investigation sought to gather evidence, the legal system sought to evaluate that evidence, and the subsequent appeals sought to reassess the conclusions that had been reached. Each stage contributed to the overall narrative, but none provided a final resolution that could be accepted without reservation. This layered process underscores the idea that understanding is not always a linear progression from uncertainty to clarity. In some cases, it involves moving through different forms of uncertainty, each shaped by the methods and perspectives applied at the time. The case of Dana Ireland reflects this pattern, as it moved from an initial lack of information to a constructed narrative and then to a reevaluation of that narrative. The result is not a single, stable conclusion, but a series of interpretations that coexist and sometimes conflict. At the same time, the human aspect of the case remains constant. Dana Ireland's life and death are not abstract elements that change with interpretation. They are the fixed points around which the rest of the case revolves. The recognition of this reality provides a grounding influence, reminding those who engage with the case that it is not only about the search for answers, but also about the impact of those answers, or the lack thereof, on the understanding of a real event. This perspective also highlights the importance of maintaining a balance between analysis and empathy. While it is necessary to examine the evidence and the processes involved, it is equally important to acknowledge the human dimension of the case. The details of Dana Ireland's life, though limited in the available information, serve as a reminder of the personal context behind the broader narrative. They ensure that the case is not reduced to a purely technical or procedural discussion. As the case continues to be revisited, it remains open to interpretation, not in the sense that anything can be concluded, but in the sense that different aspects can be emphasized or understood in different ways. This openness does not diminish the importance of the case, but it does shape how it is approached. It encourages a careful consideration of evidence, an awareness of limitations, and a recognition that some questions may not have definitive answers. In the end, the enduring nature of the case reflects the complexity of the events it encompasses. It is a story that does not resolve into a single, clear narrative, but instead remains as a combination of facts, interpretations, and ongoing questions. This combination ensures that the case continues to be relevant, not because it is frequently updated with new information, but because it raises fundamental issues about how we understand and interpret the past. The case of Dana Ireland, therefore, stands as both a specific instance of a violent event and a broader example of the challenges involved in addressing such events. It illustrates how the search for answers can extend far beyond the initial investigation and how the absence of definitive conclusions can shape the way a case is remembered. In this way, it becomes part of a continuing effort to understand not only what happened, but also how we come to terms with what may never be fully known. As the narrative of Dana Ireland's case extends into its final reflections, it becomes less about uncovering new details and more about understanding the lasting imprint it leaves behind. The case, rooted in a single night in December 1991, has unfolded across decades, moving through investigation, legal proceedings, and ongoing debate. Yet, even as time passes, it does not settle into a definitive conclusion. Instead, it remains suspended between what is known and what continues to be questioned, forming a story that resists closure while continuing to demand attention. In many ways, the endurance of this case lies in its ability to hold multiple truths at once. It is true that Dana Ireland was a young woman whose life ended violently after being found injured on a rural road. It is also true that the investigation sought to reconstruct the events that led to her death and to identify those responsible. And it is equally true that the outcomes of that process remain contested, shaped by differing interpretations of evidence and procedure. These truths do not cancel one another out. They coexist, creating a narrative that is both grounded and unresolved. This coexistence reflects a broader reality about how complex cases are understood over time. When evidence does not point conclusively in a single direction, the space for interpretation remains open. In that space, different perspectives can emerge, each drawing on the same set of facts, but arranging them in different ways. The case of Dana Ireland illustrates how this process can unfold, showing that the search for understanding does not always lead to a single answer, but can instead produce a range of possibilities that continue to be examined. The role of time in this process is significant. As years pass, the immediate urgency of the case gives way to a more reflective form of engagement. The initial focus on solving the crime transitions into a broader consideration of what the case represents. It becomes a point of reference for discussions about the limits of evidence, the challenges of investigation, and the complexities of legal judgment. In this sense, the case evolves from a specific incident into a subject of ongoing inquiry. At the same time, the passage of time does not diminish the importance of the original events. The fact that Dana Ireland's life ended as a result of a violent encounter remains central to the narrative. This fact anchors the case, ensuring that it is not reduced to an abstract discussion of evidence and procedure. It provides a constant point of reference, reminding those who consider the case that it is grounded in a real and irreversible loss. The interplay between certainty and uncertainty is perhaps the most defining feature of the case's legacy. Certain aspects are clear: the location, the date, the discovery, and the outcome. Other aspects remain uncertain: the precise sequence of events, the reliability of specific pieces of evidence, and the ultimate determination of responsibility. This combination creates a narrative that is both stable and fluid, with fixed points that provide structure and open questions that invite continued exploration. In examining this interplay, it becomes evident that the case challenges the expectation that all events can be fully understood. It suggests that there are limits to what can be known, particularly when evidence is incomplete or subject to interpretation. This does not mean that the effort to understand should be abandoned, but it does mean that the results of that effort may not always meet the desire for certainty. The case of Dana Ireland serves as a reminder of this reality, illustrating how the search for answers can lead to further questions rather than definitive conclusions. The legal history of the case reinforces this perspective. The progression from investigation to conviction and then to appeal and reconsideration demonstrates that legal outcomes are not always final. They can change as new arguments are presented and as earlier decisions are reevaluated. This process reflects the adaptability of the legal system, but it also highlights the challenges of reaching a stable conclusion in cases where the evidence is not clear-cut. The case remains an example of how legal determinations can evolve over time, reflecting both the strengths and the limitations of the system. Beyond the legal and investigative dimensions, the case also carries a broader significance in terms of how it is remembered and discussed. It becomes part of a collective awareness, a story that is revisited not only for its details, but for what it represents. In this way, it contributes to a larger conversation about how societies respond to unresolved events and how they integrate those events into their understanding of the past. This process of integration is not uniform. Different individuals and groups may emphasize different aspects of the case, leading to a variety of interpretations. Some may focus on the initial incident and the loss of life, while others may concentrate on the investigation and the legal proceedings. Still, others may examine the case as an example of broader issues within the justice system. Each of these perspectives adds to the overall narrative, creating a multifaceted understanding that reflects the complexity of the case itself. As the narrative reaches this point, it becomes clear that the case does not conclude in the traditional sense. There is no final resolution that brings all elements into alignment. Instead, there is an ongoing process of reflection, one that acknowledges both what is known and what remains uncertain. This process is not static. It continues as long as the case is remembered and discussed. In this way, the story remains active, even in the absence of new developments. The enduring presence of the case also speaks to the importance of memory. The act of remembering ensures that the events are not forgotten, even as the details may be reinterpreted over time. Memory serves as a bridge between the past and the present, allowing the case to remain part of ongoing conversations. It also provides a means of honoring the individual at the center of the story, ensuring that Dana Ireland is not reduced to a set of facts, but is recognized as a person whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of her death. In the final analysis, the case of Dana Ireland stands as a complex and enduring narrative, one that reflects both the effort to understand and the challenges of doing so. It is a story that begins with a specific event and extends into a broader exploration of uncertainty, evidence, and justice. It does not offer a clear or simple conclusion, but instead presents a series of interconnected elements that continue to be examined and understood in different ways. What remains is a recognition of both the limits and the possibilities of such examination. While not all questions may be answered, the process of asking them remains important. It reflects a commitment to understanding, to acknowledging uncertainty, and to engaging with the complexities of the past. In this sense, the case is not defined solely by what is known or unknown, but by the ongoing effort to bridge the gap between the two. The story ends not with resolution, but with continuation. It leaves behind a set of facts, a series of interpretations, and a collection of questions that remain open. Within that framework, the memory of Dana Ireland endures, as does the effort to understand the circumstances of her death. The case stands as a reminder that some stories do not conclude with certainty, but continue to exist in the space between answers, shaped by time, reflection, and the enduring pursuit of truth. In the long arc of time that follows a case like that of Dana Ireland, there is a gradual shift in how the story is held and understood. What once unfolded as an urgent investigation, then a contested legal process, becomes something quieter, but no less significant. It becomes a case that lives in reflection, in the way it is revisited and reconsidered, and in the questions that continue to echo without resolution. The absence of a definitive conclusion does not diminish the importance of the case. Instead, it gives it a different kind of permanence, one rooted in its complexity and the enduring effort to understand it. As the years continue to pass, the case stands as a reminder of how events can resist simple explanation. The facts that are known remain consistent, anchored in the timeline of December 24, 1991, and the discovery of Dana Ireland on a rural road near Kapoho. These elements form the foundation of the narrative, providing a structure that does not change. Yet everything built upon that structure remains subject to interpretation, shaped by the evidence that was gathered and the ways in which that evidence has been understood. This dual nature of stability and uncertainty defines the case's lasting presence. It allows the story to be told with a degree of clarity about what occurred in general terms, while also acknowledging that the details and conclusions are not fixed. Each retelling becomes an act of balancing these two aspects, presenting the known facts while recognizing the limits of what can be said with certainty. In this way, the case continues to evolve, not through new events, but through the ongoing process of interpretation. The role of interpretation is central to understanding why the case remains unresolved in a broader sense. When evidence is incomplete or ambiguous, it does not point directly to a single conclusion. Instead, it opens the possibility for multiple narratives, each constructed from the same underlying information but arranged differently. In the case of Dana Ireland, this has resulted in a situation where the events of that night can be described in general terms, but the precise sequence and responsibility remain contested. This situation highlights the importance of how evidence is used and understood. The investigation sought to piece together a narrative from the available data, relying on physical traces, witness statements, and later analysis. The legal system then evaluated that narrative, reaching conclusions that were later challenged and, in some instances, overturned. Each stage of this process reflects a different approach to the same set of facts, demonstrating how the interpretation of evidence can change depending on the context in which it is considered. At the same time, the case underscores the limitations inherent in such processes. Evidence can only reveal so much, and when it is affected by environmental factors, time, or uncertainty, its ability to provide clear answers is reduced. In this case, the rural setting, the lack of direct witnesses, and the condition of the scene all contributed to these limitations. The result is a narrative that, while supported by certain facts, cannot be completed with full confidence. The persistence of these limitations does not mean that the case lacks meaning. On the contrary, it is precisely this combination of known and unknown elements that gives the case its depth. It becomes a subject not only of factual analysis, but also of reflection on the nature of understanding itself. It raises questions about how we interpret incomplete information, how we weigh conflicting evidence, and how we respond to situations where certainty is not achievable. These questions extend beyond the specifics of the case and into broader considerations of justice and truth. The legal system is designed to reach conclusions based on available evidence, but it operates within the constraints of that evidence. When the evidence is uncertain, the conclusions that follow are also subject to uncertainty. The case of Dana Ireland illustrates this dynamic, showing how legal outcomes can be both definitive in their immediate context and open to challenge over time. In this sense, the case becomes a reflection of the tension between the desire for closure and the reality of complexity. Closure implies a final resolution, a point at which all questions are answered and all elements are aligned. Complexity, on the other hand, acknowledges that not all aspects of a situation can be fully understood. The case exists at the intersection of these two ideas, demonstrating how the pursuit of closure can be complicated by the presence of unresolved questions. The human element of the case remains central throughout this process. Dana Ireland's life and death are the core around which all other aspects revolve. The details that are known about her, though limited, provide a point of connection that grounds the case in reality. They remind those who consider it that it is not simply an abstract problem to be solved, but a real event with lasting consequences. This grounding is important because it shapes the way the case is approached. It encourages a perspective that combines analysis with empathy, recognizing both the need to understand what happened and the importance of acknowledging the impact of those events. It prevents the case from becoming detached from its human context, ensuring that the focus remains on the individual at its center. As the case continues to be revisited, it also becomes part of a larger narrative about how unresolved events are remembered and understood. It joins other cases that have resisted definitive conclusions, contributing to a broader understanding of the challenges involved in reconstructing the past. These cases collectively highlight the limits of knowledge and the ways in which uncertainty can persist even in the face of sustained effort. The passage of time does not resolve these challenges, but it does change how they are perceived. With distance, there is an opportunity to reflect on the case in a more measured way, considering not only the details of the incident, but also the processes that followed. This perspective allows for a deeper understanding of the factors that contributed to the case's complexity, from the initial conditions of the scene to the later stages of investigation and legal review. In the end, the case of Dana Ireland does not provide a definitive answer to the questions it raises. Instead, it offers a framework for understanding how such questions can arise and why they may remain unresolved. It demonstrates that the pursuit of truth is not always a straightforward path, and that the outcomes of that pursuit can be shaped by factors that extend beyond the immediate facts of the case. What remains is a story that continues to be told, not because it has reached a clear conclusion, but because it has not. The lack of resolution ensures that the case remains relevant, inviting continued reflection and examination. It stands as an example of how complex events can resist simple explanations, and how the effort to understand them can extend far beyond the moment in which they occurred. In this ongoing process, the memory of Dana Ireland endures, as does the effort to make sense of the circumstances that led to her death. The case remains open in the sense that its questions are still being considered, even if its events are fixed in the past. It is a story that continues to unfold in thought and discussion, shaped by the interplay of what is known and what remains uncertain. As the narrative of Dana Ireland's case reaches its final extension, it does not resolve into a traditional ending. Instead, it settles into a space defined by continuity rather than conclusion, where the story remains present not because it has been fully answered, but because it is not. The events of December 24th, 1991 continue to anchor the case in a specific moment, yet everything that followed has transformed it into something larger, something that extends beyond the incident itself and into the enduring question of how such events are understood over time. The passage of decades has not erased the uncertainties that emerged in the early stages of the investigation. If anything, those uncertainties have become more clearly defined, standing out against the fixed elements of a case. The known facts remain unchanged, forming a stable outline that can be revisited again and again. Within that outline, however, the details continue to resist final clarification. This coexistence of certainty and uncertainty gives the case its lasting complexity, ensuring that it cannot be reduced to a single, definitive narrative. In reflecting on this, it becomes clear that the case operates on multiple levels at once. On one level, it is the account of a violent incident that resulted in the death of a young woman. On another level, it is the record of an investigation and a legal process that sought to explain that incident. And on yet another level, it is an ongoing subject of reflection, shaped by the recognition that the conclusions reached are not universally accepted. These levels overlap and interact, creating a narrative that is both grounded in fact and open to interpretation. The role of interpretation in the case cannot be overstated. Every piece of evidence, every statement, and every conclusion is subject to the context in which it is considered. During the investigation, the available information was used to construct a narrative that could explain the events of that night. During the trial, that narrative was presented and evaluated within the framework of the legal system. During the appeals, it was re-examined and challenged. Each of these stages involved a process of interpretation, and each produced outcomes that reflected the perspectives and methods applied at the time. This layered process reveals how understanding is not fixed, but can evolve as new questions are raised and existing assumptions are reconsidered. It shows that the pursuit of truth is not always a linear progression toward clarity, but can involve revisiting earlier conclusions and reassessing their validity. In the case of Dana, Ireland, this process has resulted in a narrative that remains open, shaped by both what has been established and what continues to be questioned. The persistence of unanswered questions also highlights the limits of what can be achieved through investigation and legal proceedings. These processes are designed to bring clarity and resolution, but they operate within the constraints of the available evidence. When that evidence is incomplete or ambiguous, the results of those processes may also be incomplete. This does not diminish the importance of the effort, but it does mean that the outcome may not satisfy the desire for certainty. In this context, the case becomes a reflection of a broader reality about how complex events are understood. It demonstrates that, even with sustained effort, some aspects of a situation may remain beyond reach. This is not a failure of the process, but a recognition of its limitations. It acknowledges that the search for understanding is shaped by the quality and completeness of the information available, and that when that information is limited, the conclusions that can be drawn are also limited. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of continuing to engage with these limitations. Rather than accepting uncertainty as a reason to stop asking questions, it can be seen as a reason to continue exploring the case from different perspectives. Each new examination has the potential to shed light on aspects that were previously overlooked or misunderstood. While this does not guarantee a final resolution, it does contribute to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the case. The human dimension remains central throughout this process. Dana, Ireland's life, though only partially represented in the available information, is the core around which all other aspects of the case revolve. Her presence in the narrative ensures that the case is not reduced to a purely analytical exercise. It remains grounded in the reality of a person whose life was interrupted, whose story continues to be told not only because of how it ended, but because of the questions that surround it. This grounding also shapes the way the case is remembered. It encourages a perspective that balances analysis with recognition of the human impact, ensuring that the focus remains on both the search for understanding and the acknowledgement of loss. It prevents the narrative from becoming detached, maintaining a connection to the reality that underlies it. As the case continues to exist in this extended form, it becomes part of a larger pattern of unresolved or contested cases. These cases collectively highlight the challenges involved in reconstructing events that are not fully documented and in reaching conclusions that can withstand scrutiny over time. They serve as reminders that the pursuit of truth is often more complex than it might initially appear, requiring not only evidence but also careful interpretation and an awareness of limitations. Looking ahead, the future of the case remains uncertain. It is possible that new developments could emerge, whether through advances in forensic techniques or renewed attention to the case. Such developments could provide additional clarity, potentially resolving some of the questions that have persisted. However, it is equally possible that the case will remain as it is, defined by the interplay of known facts and unresolved uncertainties. This uncertainty about the future mirrors the uncertainty that has characterized the case from the beginning. In the absence of a definitive conclusion, the case continues to be defined by its ongoing nature. It is not closed in the sense of being fully resolved, nor is it entirely open in the sense of lacking any conclusions. Instead, it occupies a space in between, where certain aspects are established while others remain in question. This position reflects the complexity of the case and ensures that it remains a subject of continued interest and reflection. The story, then, does not end with a final answer, but with the recognition that not all stories do. It concludes in a way that acknowledges both the effort to understand and the limits of that understanding. It leaves behind a narrative that is both complete in its outline and incomplete in its details, inviting those who encounter it to consider not only what is known, but also what remains uncertain. In this final perspective, the case of Dana Ireland stands as a testament to the enduring nature of questions that do not have simple answers. It reflects the intersection of fact and interpretation, of investigation and uncertainty, of memory and reflection. It shows how a single event can generate a lasting narrative that continues to evolve, shaped by the ongoing effort to understand it. What remains is the story itself, carried forward through time, sustained by the balance between what can be said with confidence and what must be acknowledged as uncertain. Within that story is the memory of Dana Ireland, the record of what happened, and the recognition that the search for understanding does not always lead to closure, but can instead become an ongoing process that defines how the past is remembered and considered. As the narrative continues into this final extension, what remains most striking about the case of Dana Ireland is not simply the violence of the event itself, but the way in which it has endured without a conclusion that feels complete. The story does not close in the conventional sense. It does not arrive at a point where every question is answered or where every perspective aligns. Instead, it remains suspended in a space where facts exist alongside uncertainty, where conclusions have been reached and then challenged, and where the passage of time has not erased the complexity, but has instead reinforced it. In examining the full arc of the case, from the night of December 24th, 1991 to the decades that followed, it becomes clear that the search for understanding has been as significant as the answers themselves. Each stage of the process, from the initial discovery to the investigation, from the identification of suspects to the legal proceedings and appeals, represents an effort to impose clarity on a set of events that resisted simple explanation. These efforts were not without result, but neither did they produce a final resolution that could be accepted without question. The case remains defined by that tension, by the coexistence of conclusions and doubts. This tension is not unique to this case, but it is particularly visible here because of the factors involved. The rural setting, the lack of direct witnesses, the ambiguity of key evidence, and the questions surrounding the investigative process all contribute to a situation in which certainty is difficult to achieve. Each of these factors alone would present challenges, but together they create a level of complexity that extends beyond what can be easily resolved. The case becomes an example of how these elements can combine to shape both the investigation and the way it is remembered. At the same time, the persistence of the case highlights the importance of continuing to engage with difficult questions. Even when answers are not definitive, the process of examining the available information remains valuable. It allows for a deeper understanding of the factors that influence how cases are investigated and how conclusions are reached. It also provides an opportunity to reflect on the limitations of those processes, acknowledging that not all uncertainties can be eliminated. The role of reflection in this context is significant. As the case moves further from the time of the original events, it becomes less about immediate action and more about interpretation and understanding. This shift allows for a broader perspective, one that considers not only the details of the case, but also its implications. It invites questions about how similar cases might be approached in the future and what can be learned from the challenges encountered here. In this way, the case contributes to an ongoing conversation about the nature of investigation and justice. The idea of justice itself becomes more complex when viewed through the lens of this case. Justice is often associated with resolution, with the identification of responsibility and the establishment of accountability. In situations where conclusions are contested, however, that association becomes less straightforward. The legal system may reach decisions, but those decisions may not be universally accepted as final or definitive. This creates a situation in which justice is pursued but not fully settled, leaving room for continued debate and reflection. This does not diminish the significance of the legal process, but it does highlight the challenges involved in applying it to cases where the evidence is not clear-cut. It shows that the outcomes of legal proceedings are shaped by the information available at the time, and that those outcomes can be revisited as new questions arise. The case of Dana, Ireland illustrates this dynamic, demonstrating how legal conclusions can evolve and how the perception of those conclusions can change over time. Throughout all of this, the central fact remains unchanged. Dana, Ireland lost her life as a result of a violent encounter on a rural road. This fact anchors the case, providing a point of certainty that stands in contrast to the uncertainties that surround it. It ensures that the case is not reduced to a series of abstract questions, but remains grounded in the reality of a specific event and its consequences. The recognition of this reality is essential to understanding the case in its entirety. It reminds us that behind the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the ongoing debate, there is a human story. It is a story of a life that was interrupted, of a moment that altered everything, and of the effort to understand what happened in its aftermath. This perspective helps to maintain a sense of balance, ensuring that the focus remains not only on the search for answers, but also on the significance of what is being examined. As the narrative reaches this point, it becomes clear that the case does not conclude in a definitive way. Instead, it continues to exist as a complex and evolving story, one that reflects both the effort to understand and the limitations of that effort. It is a story that resists simplification, requiring those who engage with it to accept that not all questions can be answered and that some aspects may remain uncertain. This acceptance does not mean abandoning the search for understanding. Rather, it involves recognizing that the search itself is an ongoing process, one that can continue even in the absence of final answers. Each examination of the case adds to the overall understanding, even if it does not resolve every question. In this way, the case remains active, not through new developments, but through the continued effort to engage with it. The enduring nature of the case also reflects the way in which stories are carried forward over time. They are not static, but are shaped by the perspectives of those who revisit them. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects, bringing new insights or highlighting existing uncertainties. This process ensures that the case remains part of an ongoing conversation, one that evolves as it is revisited and reconsidered. In the final analysis, the case of Dana, Ireland stands as a testament to the complexity of seeking truth in situations where the evidence does not provide clear answers. It illustrates the interplay between fact and interpretation, between investigation and uncertainty, and between the desire for closure and the reality that closure may not always be possible. It shows how a single event can generate a lasting narrative that continues to be examined long after it has occurred. What remains, ultimately, is the recognition that some stories do not end in certainty. They continue to exist in the space between what is known and what is not, shaped by the ongoing effort to understand them. The case of Dana, Ireland is one such story. It is defined not only by the events of that night, but by the years of reflection that have followed, by the questions that remain, and by the enduring presence of the person at its center. In this sense, the story does not end with this final part. It continues wherever it is remembered, discussed, or reconsidered. It persists as a narrative that invites engagement, not because it provides all the answers, but because it does not. Within that persistence lies its significance, as both a specific case and a broader reflection on the nature of understanding, memory, and the pursuit of truth.